and welcome to Genealogy Adventures. This is going to be a fairly short video. Basically, it's aimed at people who either have never done family history or genealogical research, or those of you who have contemplated it, not quite sure if it's what you want to do, what might be involved, or for those of you who have literally just started on your own kind of genealogy adventures. So I hope that you find the content of this video helpful and instructional. So again, one of the first kind of hurdles that you're going to have to overcome is deciding what family you're going to start with. Because if you think about it, I mean, if you start with your own immediate family, that's going to be four different families to take a look at. So on your father's side of the family, you're going to have two families. On your mother's side of the family, you're going to have two families as well, so that's four. So in my instance, in my case, on my father's side, it's looking at the Sheffys and the Roans. On my maternal side of the family, it's looking at the Turners and the Matthews. If you take that back one generation and start looking at your great-grandparents, then you have six families that you have to do some research on. And if you take that back a further generation, two generations, looking at your great-grandparents, then basically you're going to have 10 families that you're going to have to do some research on. So whether it's 4, 6, or 10, that's a lot of families and a lot of time and a lot of research. That kind of a number is going to be really, really overwhelming. So in my own instance, because I'd already researched 3 or 4 generations of my father's family on the Sheffy side, it just kind of made sense that would be the family that I would prefer to stick with. I already knew something about them. I'd already done my direct line of descent back to my third great-grandfather, Daniel Henry Sheffy. So it just kind of made sense to stick with what I already knew, make sure that the information that I had about them was completely accurate before I started looking at even other different branches of the Sheffy family. Again, I just wanted to make sure that everything that I had was completely correct, that I had citations, proper notes, all of that kind of a thing. And again, it did make it easier. I mean, as soon as I went back 2 generations, I already had 11 people that I had to kind of keep track of. And in a way, it is kind of getting to know them. Again, I keep stressing genealogy and family history. It's more than just names and dates of birth and who they married or whether they had children or who their children were. It's really about trying to understand the world that they lived in. If you can find anything that they might have written or that was written about them, anything that can turn them into real 3-dimensional human beings, rather than just abstract kind of, yeah, that's my great-grandfather, he lived from this date to this date, and he lived in this, this part of the world. Again, it's all about making them seem like people. And again, that's part of the process that makes it really, really interesting for me. So as I said, as soon as I went back 2 generations, looking at my great-grandparents, there were immediately 11 people to kind of get my head around and think about and research. And it took me a good 6 months just to get as much information about these 11 individuals as I possibly humanly could. So that was, again, a really, really important aspect for me. So again, these 11 people that quickly came to the fore, there was my paternal grandfather, Joseph Christopher Sheffy Sr., who had 7 brothers and sisters. Again, we never heard of any of them, so it took quite a bit of time to find out if they were indeed his brothers and sisters, and to find out more about them, to find out where they lived, what they did for occupations, all that kind of thing. So there was his 7 brothers and sisters. Then going back to my great-grandfather, Daniel Henry Sheffy, who was born in 1844. Well, he had 4 known brothers and sisters. So again, each one of them took a bit of time to make sure that I indeed had the right family group for him. And then stretching that back to find out information about his parents, his father, which would be my great-great-grandfather. Sorry, my third great-grandfather. That would be Daniel Henry Sheffy Sr., born in 1820. And again, finding out more about his family, his sisters. So again, it's all about your comfort zone, not taking on too much, because again, it can become really, really intimidating. Genealogy is time-consuming. It takes a lot of time to verify that what you found is correct, that those records really are about the ancestor or ancestors that you're investigating and that you're looking at. It's always really, really important to make sure that you get that information correct, because especially if you publish it online, there are going to be other people who are going to be looking at the same family groups, same people. So anything that we can do, even as amateur genealogists, to provide information about our family, we should always strive to make sure that that information is 100% correct, and to also cite the sources where we found the information whenever and wherever we can. It just makes it easier for other people from other branches of the family or from the same branch of the family to be able to kind of double check what it is that you've done to make sure that it's correct for them. One of the first records you're actually going to more than likely come across are census returns, which can be both a blessing and a curse. Obviously, that's one of the most direct and accessible routes that we actually have in terms of doing family research. At the very least, getting a rough idea of when our ancestors were alive, what they did for an occupation, because all of that information is actually in there in the census return. Were they farmers? Were they coming from an agricultural background? Were they a tradesman? Were they an artisan? What is it exactly that they did? And that might not seem like a really important kind of bit of information, but again, it's all about building a profile. And again, within my own family, it's been interesting to kind of see the development in terms of what they did for occupations through the length and breadth of basically the entirety of the American historical experience. So from the earliest days of the American colonies, that was back in the days when they still were colonies. It was a very agricultural society. It had lots of artisans as well, but it was primarily an agricultural society. My family's trades and occupations readily mirror that. So again, they're agricultural workers, they're farmers, they're general laborers. There's a couple of artisans thrown in there. There's shoemakers. Again, on the Sheffy and the Roan side of the family, there are plenty of congressmen, House of Representative type people, judges, lawyers, all that kind of thing. So a real kind of diversity, both, as I said, in terms of an agricultural background as well as trade and profession. A really good kind of mix in there as well. And again, it's not really going to come as any great surprise to anyone, but slavery figures quite largely in the family history on the black side of the family as well. So again, that comes into place. I'll get into more about the kind of, I'm not going to call them difficulties or impossibilities, but the challenges of researching your slave ancestors in another video. But I'm lightly touching on that one now. Again, it's all about the quality of interpretive information that you can actually get from videos, provide you with a really deeper insight into kind of your family's kind of historical development, as it were. So again, that's really quite important to pick up on. As I said, census returns are both a blessing and a curse. They are by no means 100% accurate. Either census takers had really off days, or there was a language barrier, or they just they didn't understand certain accents. And it has some pretty wild and weird and wonderful spelling variations of people's names. As much as I like to be 100% accurate, I always note discrepancies, because even I'm not enough. Unless I see that birth certificate or death certificate, and even then, I've seen it where names have been misspelled. It's by no means guaranteed that what you're looking at is actually the definitive bit of information. Try as hard as you can to be as accurate as you can, and to get those citations and list your sources. The one thing you will quickly notice on census returns, names can be a bit interesting. It can be a bit fun. It can be a bit fun and funky, kind of deciphering that one. And that can be both first names and last names. And again, if your ancestors had in any way an unusual name, be it a last name or a first name, you can have all kinds of crazy variations. I mean, even the name Roan, I would think that that's a pretty easy name to be able to spell. R-O-N-E. You'll see it without the E. You'll see it R-O-A-N-E. R-H-O-N-E. There's a couple of other weird ones in there. But again, it's keeping in the back of your mind. You know what your family name is, or at least you know how you spell it now. That may not have always been the case. I guess the kind of cool thing about family names is, especially in the Middle Ages, up to the roughly 17th century, people spelled things phonetically. Some spellings were considered fashionable, and then they went out of fashion. So again, that's why you tend to have a lot of variations in family names. Another one that's been a real challenge for me to kind of investigate is the Bartolot family. Now, this is a family of the lower nobility in England. They came from Normandy with William the Conqueror. The variations boggle the mind. I mean, I've come across about 20 different variations just within the name Bartolot. Then you get Bartletts, who are also descended of the Bartolot family. There's a couple of other variations in there. So don't get too hung up on the accuracy of the spelling of your family surname. Keep in mind that there could be some interesting interpretations of what the census taker actually heard. I guess they didn't really have time to clarify. I guess they didn't have time to actually stand there at the doorstep and say, can you please spell your first name? Can you please spell your last name? They just basically took it down. Alternatively, years of birth. Also really, really tricky. I guess census takers will ask someone's age. Well, I think I'm 22. I think I'm 23. So they would basically give an approximate date of birth. But again, that's the other good reason about kind of keeping your family tree small to begin with, until you really kind of get used to the rhythm and the process of researching your family. By having fewer family members to actually do that thorough kind of research and checks on, the easier it's going to be for you. And you're going to feel more confident. You'll start to recognize, oh, maybe I should look for this instead of this, and maybe I should search on that variation of a family name instead of that variation of a family name. These are all like little considerations to take into account. So again, I would probably say for the first, unless your ancestors had traditionally very small families, I would really hardly recommend that you just kind of stick with immediate, say, 3 or 4 generations of your immediate family line before you start getting ambitious and looking at tangent branches of your family, or starting to investigate say, your mother's side of the family. Or vice versa, if you started researching your mother's side of the family to then switch over to your father's side of the family. Just make sure that you kind of get familiar with the different places you can go to do family research. Again, I'll be touching on that topic in another video as well, because there's plenty of online resources to use to be able to find that kind of family history as well. So again, name may not be spelt the way that you would think it would be. Date of birth could be a wild guess, and again, especially as my family goes back to almost right to the very beginning of the foundation of the American colonies. That's going back fairly a long way. A lot of them maybe didn't know their date of birth, or at least their year of birth, so they're trying to guess what their age is as well. Again, thinking about it, tracking one particular ancestor of mine, his date of birth is different on every single census return, covering a 20-year period. I think he was being a bit optimistic there. Funny enough, his age kept going down, which is kind of a cool trick if you can get away with it, but his age seemed to be going down from census return to census return. He was married twice. On both his marriage certificates were 2 completely different dates of birth. Again, a 10-year spread between his first marriage and his second marriage. His age went down 10 years. Not quite sure how that one works out either. And again, on his, in terms of his death certificate and his headstone, completely different date of birth. So don't get too married to exact years of birth. Just keep in mind that in some instances there can be some pretty crazy variations going on there. In terms of African American family research and census returns, one thing that I find that tends to be very, very overlooked, but is really, really important, and I know it's a bit controversial and I know it's a bit of a tricky subject, but, and honestly couldn't tell you when the practice stopped off the top of my head. But basically, people of African descent in America were either listed as being black or mulatto. One thing that I will say in terms of consistency for the census returns is, I guess if you were an African American from at least a medium complexion to a light complexion, once you were a mulatto in a census return, you were always cited as being a mulatto. It's very rare. I've only ever seen it once doing my family research, was someone cited as being first mulatto and then black, or then black and then mulatto. That very, very, very rarely happens. So basically, because again, family names tend to be very popular. For instance, George Roan. Not only were there about 10 George Roans from different generations alive at the same time on the white side of the family, there were about 6 or 7 black George Roans spread throughout many different counties in Virginia. And all of these men were alive at the same time with the same name. Putting the white side of the family to one side just for a moment, on the black side of the family, the thing that really helped me the most was looking at race and the description that was given of them on the census return, whether they were mulatto or black. That I found quite helpful, along with an approximate date of birth, to make sure that I was actually tracking the right individual from census return to census return. Because again, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And again, if you have 5 African American George Roans born roughly the same within a year or two of each other, roughly living in the same part of Virginia, for argument's sake, let's say King and Queen County, for instance, or Northampton County, which are counties associated with strongly with my Roan ancestors. When it comes time to tracking who they married, because you can see a marriage certificate, it could say Emily Carpenter married George Roan in King and Queen County. It gives an approximate date of year of birth. Say it was, 1853, where you have, say, 4 or 5 George Roans, all living in King and Queen County, most of them born, in that year, 1853, or around there. It could be 1852, 51, 55, you don't know. The thing is, and the marriage certificates didn't always have their parents' names, so it takes a lot of kind of detective work to make sure that you match the right Emily Carpenter to the right George Roan. Because I would hate to make that kind of mistake. And there's nothing more embarrassing than to get the occasional email from someone or message on Ancestry.com or Family Search to say, yeah, I'm afraid Emily Carpenter, she did marry George Roan, but she didn't marry the one that you said she did. She's actually married this one. And I knew that because she's my great-great-great-grandmother. So again, it's all about that kind of quality of data, quality of information that you're providing. So again, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get started looking at census returns. They're the most immediate thing to find. They're one of the easiest things to find. And you will find your ancestors in there. What I tended to do, even from the very beginning, is as soon as I started coming across, say, other members of the Sheffy family that weren't in my direct line, I would always make notes about them, and I'd always save links to those census returns or that information that I found about them in a little folder. One of the tips that I do is I break down. I have folders on my PC and on my notebook. Each folder is a year or a decade. So I might say the 1850s for the Sheffy family. And any record that I find that happens in the 1850s for the Sheffy family that wasn't a direct ancestor of mine, I just save that information there. It's another little tip and trick that I will give you is never ever assume that you're going to find the same record twice, or that you're going to find it easily. For instance, I'm still kicking myself to this very day that just on a fluke, I happened to find something about my 3 times great-grandfather, Daniel Henry Sheffy, the one that was born in the 1820s, that actually gave a pretty good clue about his paternity. I just thought, well, I found that one easily enough. I won't bother bookmarking it or saving the link to the appropriate folder, I'm sure I'm going to be able to find it again. 4 years later, I still can't find that record. I can't remember what search phrase I used. It was probably something really, really simple. I cannot, for love or money, find that record. It was a really important record because it was actually a slave census record that actually had his name in it. For love or money, I cannot find it. 4 years, can't find it. Absolutely kicking myself. And I learned a really important lesson. Whatever record I come across, whether it's directly related to me or not, I save it. So I can save the links in folders that I have in my favorite folders on, whether you use Internet Explorer or whatever. But I also make sure that I save the link as well on my hard drive, so I can always come back to it. Sometimes you will miss some pretty crucial information off the census return, especially as you just starting. You kind of can't really gauge what's going to be important and what isn't. And again, it's just good genealogical family history practice to make sure that you keep hold of every single record, every bit of evidence that you come across within your family history search. So that kind of gonna wrap this one up here at the moment. Again, I hope that you find this kind of introductory kind of tips and tricks and things to think about helpful and useful. So as I said, my top tips for this is when you first start embarking on doing your own family genealogy, your own family history, really, really limit your search to one line and one line only. Trace your direct descent first, and then you can start filling in the family tree with brothers and sisters of your great-great-grandparents or your great-grandparents, and start tracing their descendants. And I mean, that's going to probably be the most meaningful thing to you anyway, because you're going to more than likely stumble across, say, cousins 2, 3, 4 times removed that are more closely related to you than, say, people from tangent branches of the family. And by tangent branches, I mean, say, for instance, your 4 times great-grandfather's brothers and sisters, their descendants. They're going to be much further removed from you in time. You're still related, you're still blood relatives, but they're not going to be your real immediate family. For those, you would need to start looking at your grandparent siblings, your great-grandparent siblings, and their descendants. They're just going to be much more, in terms of time and immediacy, they're going to be much more closely related to you. So again, it just kind of makes sense to really focus on the first couple of immediate generations of your family. Start feeling confident with the kind of search tips, search tricks, tools that you're going to use. Start creating your process about how you're going to save the records that you find. How are you going to save the information that you're going to find? How are you going to present the information that you find as well? So really keeping a lockdown on the number of people that you're researching at any given point in time is one, going to give you a lot more confidence, hopefully, and two, it just makes the whole process so much more manageable. And again, it's going to enable you to remember more information about the individuals that you're researching. Two, I'm going to start with census returns, because that's probably the basic place that most people start, is looking at census returns. So again, dates of birth, important to a point. Bear in mind that probably I would say that about 60% of the time, the dates of birth, the years of birth, aren't going to be accurate. Also, when you're doing your research, keep in mind about variations of first names and last names. Get wild, weird, and funky, and especially the more distinctive the name is. For instance, on the Sheffy side of the family, there was a chap, we didn't know what he was called, because every census return it seemed as though he had a completely different name. So in one census return, he was Lagwell Sheffy, and another census return, he was Fayswell Sheffy, and another census return, he was Taswell Sheffy. And in another census return, he was something completely different. It was a combination of things. It was really quite weird. And then to basically get an email from a very nice woman called Vanessa Williams out of the blue that said, yeah, actually you're wrong. His name is Yazwell, and I know that because my grandmother was actually related to him. And actually his name wasn't any of the ones that you've given. His name is actually Yazwell, which I had to kind of burst out laughing because I think Yazwell was the only variation that I had never come across, and that was actually the correct name for him. So again, think about that in terms of, don't be too, when you're doing your online search, by all means use the correct spelling, but do bear in mind that if you get a result that's not the correct spelling of the name, still have a look at it, because there's a good chance that still might be your ancestor. It's just his or her name just happened to be misspelled. So thank you for joining me. Again, I hope that you found this really, really helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in our next edition of Genealogy Adventures. Until then, take care. Bye.